Hello, this is Forest of Oak, Lesson 16, The Fairy Realm. Firstly, the world of fairy is huge, and I mean huge, from small sprites and house brownies covering merfolk, goblins, elves, and right up to giants and trolls. And each culture will also have its own unique races of fairy too. If you feel drawn to walk the path of fairy, remember that it is a commitment. Working with the world of fairy is not something to dabble in or be complacent about. Whilst the fair folk can certainly help and guide us, they can also confuse and trick us and be downright nasty if they feel the urge. In ancient Britain, Anglo-Saxons would have used the word elf. The word fairy or fairy, spelled Faerie, comes from the ancient French phase, which is spelled Faes, derived from the Latin fata or fatum, meaning destiny or enchantment. It was first used around the 13th or 14th century to describe spirit beings who had been central for hundreds of years in the oral folk tradition of many lands. By the 17th century, there were many variations of the spelling of the word fairy. Fairy originally meant a state of enchantment or glamour, the power of illusion, reflecting the power of beings who might bring blessings or curses and ambivalence towards such beings. It was fear of angering the fairy folk by speaking their name that led to them being given a variety of euphemisms that might, by a process of magic, attract only their benevolence. You will find tales, folklore lore, and experiences with the fae folk in most cultures across the world. When drawing on information to work with the fairy world, please do seek out proper sources, folklore and non-fiction works, rather than modern fantasy fiction. And there is a big difference. The origins. Where do fairies originate from? A question with no definitive answer. Most cultures have their own creation myths for the existence of fairies. In Norse mythology, maggots emerged from the corpse of the giant Ymir, turned into light and dark elves. The light elves lived in the air and were happy and bright. The dark elves lived underground and were evil and nasty. In Iceland, the story tells that Eve was washing her children in a river when God spoke to her. In fear, she hid these children that she had not washed. God asked if all her children were present, to which she replied yes. God decreed that the children she had hidden from him would forever be hidden from man. These children became elves or fairies. In some cultures, fairies are considered to be fallen angels, not good enough to be in heaven, but not quite evil enough to reside in hell, destined to live in the in-between world, although tales of fairies do predate Christianity. Where does the realm of fairy exist? The fairy realm is just that, a realm in its own right that runs alongside ours, and every so often our worlds intersect. Media and literature would have us imagine all sorts of wonderful, mystical, faraway places to be the land of the Fae, but in actual fact, fairy is all around us. Nature provides us with the portals, we just need to open our eyes to see them. You might also be surprised that it can look like many things. The world of fairy, or the other world, as it is often called, has many landscapes. It isn't just wildflower fields and woodlands, although they do have them. The world of fairy also has cities. A lot of fairy places may also look just like our own towns and villages. Each culture has its own beliefs about what the Fey land looks like and where it is located. Avalon is perhaps one of the most famous beliefs, the fairy world which King Arthur was taken when mortally wounded. The Irish call it the other world. Others believe it is beneath hills or mountains, and some say on faraway islands. Ancient earthworks or barrows are often believed to be the residence of fairies. The Gaelic word for fairy is she. and translate as people of the hills. These underground places are said to be marked by fairy trees at the entrance, often hawthorn, oak, or ash trees. Do you dare investigate those fairy hills, though? In 1854, the Reverend F. Warne wrote about a group of men looking for treasure in a hill called Castle Nerosh in Somerset. He said they violated the sanctity of this mysterious hill, but before they had found a single coin, they were seized with a panic fear and renounced their presumptions, enterprises, and wonderful and awful to relate within 1 month of the commencement of their enterprise, some by accident, some by sudden death, and some by violent fevers, all paid with their lives. What do you think of as fairy? I think the general idea is to think of fairies as little flittery things with gossamer wings, stripy tights, and a tutu. There are some wonderful artist impressions along these lines, such as Linda Ravenscroft, and there is one of her images on the lesson PDF, and Amy Brown. There are, of course, many, many races and species of fairy, as wide and diverse as ours, if not more so, and quite possibly none of them have ever worn a tutu or stripy tights. Don't be fooled by the sparkly, glittery fluff idea of their image. For me, the real images of the fairy world are better interpreted by the artwork of Brian Froud. And again, there's an image of some of his work on the lesson PDF. But you can absolutely make up your own mind. Modern fairy tales and films tend to portray fairy folk as tiny beings. Think of Tinker Bell in the Peter Pan films. She was always so small you could hold her in the palm of your hand. But the idea of tiny fairies seems to date back to medieval folk tales. The Elizabethans and Jacobeans liked the idea of everything being in miniature, and thus they reduced the fairies to tiny beings too. Rolling into Victorian times, and fairies were incredibly popular. Folk tales of fairy were rewritten and reimagined with a more romantic slant. They took away the warnings and danger and power associated with fairy and put them in flower petal skirts and filled them with light and sparkles. So the tiny flowery fairies mostly evolved from English literature rather than the older folk tales and beliefs. There is a lot of fantasy and romanticism attached to these. And what about the wings? It seems the idea of fairies having wings traces back to 18th century theatre. Adding wings to the costume of an actor showed the audience that they were playing the part of a fairy. Before this, there doesn't appear to be any mention of winged fairies in folk tales. And back to the tutu media and the art world, they often portrayed fairies in petal skirts or leafy tunics. In my research and experience, the fae will wear whatever they want to. They would choose garments that help them to blend in with the culture and age of the humans that are around them at the time. Don't be surprised to see an elf rock up in jeans. And of course, a lot of fairies have the ability to shapeshift into any shape, size, animal, or otherwise. The author Robert Kirk wrote in 1691 about the essence of fairy, describing it as of a middle nature betwixt man and angel, and have light interchangeable bodies like those called astral, somewhat of the nature of a condensed cloud, and best seen in twilight. These bodies, by so pliable through the subtlety of the sprites that agitate them, then they can make them appear or disappear at pleasure. How long do fairies live? We have no idea, to be honest. Some say they are immortal, but there have been recordings of fairy funerals, which would leave us to believe they do die at some point. However, having said that, there is also the suggestion that fairies never die, but like to mimic humans, so the funerals could all be a show. William Blake, 1757 to 1827, famously witnessed a fairy funeral and saw creatures of the size and colour of green and grey grasshoppers bearing a body laid out on a rose leaf. Let's look at fairy etiquette. The Fae do like meeting with humans, but they are quite particular. The most important things to remember that the Fae require are respect and trust. Most fairies have the ability to provide you with luck at will. However, whether it's good luck or bad luck is up to the fairy and how you treat them. The Fae are also famous for their sense of humour and their practical jokes, so you also need to be able to laugh with them. They are mischievous and can also be spiteful if the mood takes them. If you are open with them, respect them and their habitat, honour them, and show them you trust them, then you will be able to work with them. Most importantly, never command them or demand anything from them. This sort of action will break all ties with them. If you would like to work with them, then invite them or request their company as you would with a special friend. Working with the Fae is like any relationship. It takes time and effort to build. You need to get to know them and how to deal with them before you work with them. There is no shortcut. You will need to do your homework, start with folklore and traditional beliefs. And although it might seem bizarre, never say thank you to a fairy. They don't like it. Whatever the reason is, perhaps it's just something too human, or maybe they don't like the tone of it, believing it to sound like you are more important than them. Some thought is that it means you are indebted to them, and they might want some repayment. Instead of thanking them, leave them a gift. Fairies respect their privacy. If you see or find a place that has the feel of the Fae about it, or you catch a glimpse of them, trust your instinct. Stay quiet and still until you are judged whether you are welcome there or not. And of course, fairy etiquette may vary from culture to culture. Get to know your subject. Remember, the Fae folk are not human. They have a completely different way of thinking, working, and how they deal with situations and people. They have guidelines for how a fairy treats a fairy, but that doesn't stretch to humans. Humans are fair game. They don't see any problem with stealing or harming humans. Don't lie to a fairy. They are always honest and expect the same in return. A promise is a promise. If you promise something to a fairy, you'd better keep your word. If you cannot keep your promise, then you'd better give a good explanation and be prepared for them to be angry about it. They will also expect something else as an alternative offering. The best advice is never to promise anything to a fairy. Fairy folk do like to take things from us, but they usually repay it in some way. Not always what we want in return, but they do settle their debts. But they will take something if they want it, and it won't always be returned. If a fairy offers you a gift, accept it, but remember that fairy gifts aren't always what they seem to be. A fairy gift is often a trap, which will bind you to the fairy, or it could initially seem to be precious, but turn out to be useless. Trust your intuition on this one. If it feels hinky, refuse. Better to deal with an angry fairy because you turned down the gift than be trapped by them. If you find yourself in a tricky situation with a fairy and don't want to do what they ask or accept a gift, negotiate. And of course, you can always say no. The power of a name. Everyone has the name they were given at birth or the one they choose to use in public. There is another level. There is the true name. This is the one that resonates at your most inner and private level. The same is true for fairies. If you know a true name for someone or a fairy, then you have power and control over them. Knowing that name can give you the power to command them at will. Think of the fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin. The only way out of his contract was to learn his true name. The lesson here is never to give your true name to anyone, particularly fairy. Fairy may want to give you a name which is also strongly advised against, because the act of naming someone is seen as a gift and then you will be indebted to them. When dealing with a fairy, it is perhaps wise to choose a magical name to use whenever in contact with the world of the fairies. One of the first rules of fairy I learnt was never dance or partake of food and drink when on a visit to the realm of the Fae. This can lead to entrapment, although I have heard that witches are said to be amongst the only mortals who may blur these rules slightly, although it has never been tested. There are many stories that warn about not eating fairy food. Doing so will bind you to their world and you will never be able to leave. Also, don't be drawn into the belief that the food offered will be a rosy red apple or some kind of medieval banquet. They are just as likely to offer you pizza or a chocolate muffin. However, just to be contrary, if you are offered food by fairy royalty, that is usually safe to eat. Remember, when I say trapped, it can mean completely, mentally, and physically, but it can also mean just leaving a part of yourself behind. This can leave you feeling spaced out, distracted, and unfocused. Nothing in fairy is free. Every gift, every favour, everything fairy does for you comes with a price that must be paid back. This can usually be balanced by giving them a food offering. You can, of course, gain credit by giving them offerings of food and drink without expecting anything in return. This is a way of building up a relationship. Iron. In a lot of folklore, you will see mention that fairy won't touch or go near iron. Whilst this is true with a lot of the Fae folk, not all of them are sensitive to it. Most folk tales are also specific that the iron must be bare, i.e., not covered with any fabric or wood, and also needs to be aimed specifically at the fairy to ward it off. A modern alternative is to use steel instead of iron, preferably something sharp such as scissors or nails. Keep the item close to you or put it above an entrance to keep the Fae out. Turning your clothes inside out is also believed to dispel fairies and to provide protection. Offerings should be given regularly, once a week works well. More if you have asked for something or disturbed a space you shouldn't have. Offerings were traditionally given to protect against them, causing any harm or disruption, or to gain a blessing or good fortune from them. Some also believe that an offering should be given as a mark of respect, that the fairies are due a portion of what we have because it is rightly theirs. Do bear in mind that once you start a regular routine on offerings, you will need to keep going with it. Stopping it suddenly could cause them to become angry. Ideas for offerings are milk and honey, butter, berries, nuts, read a poem or sing a song, light a candle, cookies or cake, your favourite drink, sweets and coins. Music. The Fae love music. The fairy musicians are said to be skilled in singing, songwriting, and playing instruments. They are said to be drawn to human musicians in particular. The fairy musician music is beautiful and wild and also captivating to human ears, literally. Listening to a fairy song can send you into a fatal sleep, and they love to dance. Fairy rings. There are many stories about fairy rings, often created from rings of mushrooms or toadstools, sometimes seemingly appearing overnight. It is within these rings that the fairies dance. Any human stepping into the ring will be caught up in the dance, which can last for hours or even years. The toadstool we are most familiar with in images of the fairy world is the fly agaric. This one has poisonous hallucinogenic properties. Red toadstools appear in some Norse and Celtic tales. The fly agaric in particular have been described as a food for the gods. Some fairy rings have been in the same place for over 600 years. So how do you go about contacting the Fae? Having given all the warnings, working with fairy can be very rewarding, and if you follow the guidelines, you can build a magical relationship with them. So how do you do that? The artist and creator Brian Froud gives this quote: "Fairies are seen not by the eyes, but through the heart." What I would say is pretty much spot on. Before any work with fairy, it is advisable to have a cleansing routine. You might like to take a ritual bath before any fairy work. You can visualize a cleansing light encasing your body and clearing out any negative energy. You and your workspace can be smudged with incense smoke or salt water. Herbs such as mugwort and rosemary work well. This just ensures you don't bring any stray or unwanted energy with you before you work magic. You can also use meditation. This is an excellent way to contact the Fae via the astral plane. You could also take yourself outside, go and find a place in nature to sit quietly to see if you can catch a glimpse of them. The beach, a park, garden, a forest, streams, pretty much anywhere outside where it is quiet. There are better times of the day to encounter the Fae. They prefer the liminal times of dawn and dusk, but midnight is also a good point. Cast a spell or make a charm requesting the ability to see the Fae. You could request their presence whilst in circle, invite them to represent the four directions, do this as you would usually call the quarters, but invite them in rather than command them. Plant flowers in your garden that are specifically linked to the Fae. Create a witch bottle or spell pouch that will attract the Fae to you. Don't discount the dream world for meeting the Fae. To request Fae in circle, you would use the four elementals: gnomes for earth or north, sylphs for air east, undines for water west, and salamanders for fire and south. Remember to always ground after any meditation or journey work. Journal. I know it might sound boring to write everything down, but it is useful to keep a journal for any meditation or journeying work. You can keep a record of fairy meetings, descriptions, and insights or messages given. It can also be useful to jot down any promises that you have made. When you visit the other world, particularly at first, it is wise to go with a guide, and this can be done with the use of meditation. A fairy altar. One way to honour fairy and invite them in is to create an altar dedicated to the fair folk. It can be a shelf, a table, top of a sideboard, or even a bowl or box that you fill with items to look at each day. Sparkly things, tree lights, fairy ornaments, crystals, feathers, glitter, or you may want to attract more earthy fae, so you could use moss, driftwood and twigs, or perhaps a sea theme with shells and driftwood. And the fae love mirrors. Candles and fairy statues also work well. The only thing not to put on your altar is metal, particularly lead, as fairies have a strong aversion to it, although silver, gold and copper are acceptable. Trust your intuition and be guided by it on what to place there. You will find your altar is fluid and things will be added and taken away over time. Use this altar as a focus. Leave offerings for the Fae. Communicate with them here. Tell them your thoughts. Express your wishes and spells. Fairies, as a quirk of their nature though, dislike being thanked and displays of gratitude. They do, however, demand respect and appreciate small tokens of gifts. But of course they are particular about what gifts they like too. They love milk, cream, cake, butter and mead. Leave some in a small shell or a walnut shell would be just right. What do you think the Fae could help with? Folk tales have long told of fairies helping to heal people, often for the exchange of a song or some offering of food. There are numerous spells for working with the Fae, for house protection, healing illnesses, and finding lost objects. Use fairy dream magic to answer questions. Use fairy plants to heal illnesses. Using elemental fairy magic for wholeness and well-being. Fairy spells to heal emotions. Fairy astral projection to heal your spirituality. All of these can be worked, but I would strongly recommend making a connection and building a relationship with the fairy realm first. Helping out with work is also a recurring theme. The Elves and the Shoemaker is a very famous story that depicts the elves creating shoes for the shoemaker in return for clothes. Fairy tales tell of fairies' gold when the fairy helped by giving humans what looks like gold. The human pay their monthly bills or what they owe in debt. Sadly, the following day, the fairy gold usually turns from gold back into bread or sweet treats. There is, of course, a flip side to this, because the fae can be cruel too. Folk tales tell of people being struck down with illness or deformities. This includes sending people blind or mad. Fairy tales describe the fair folk killing animals such as cows, often what is referred to as elf-shot. The fair folk have been known to enchant people into dancing or playing to the point of complete exhaustion, even death. Some diseases have been blamed on fairy in the past. The term elf stroke has since been shortened and is now known as a stroke. Originally, it was believed the elf stroke victim was carried away by fairy and a replacement body left behind to die. Rheumatism, cramps, and bruises were said to have been caused by fairies pinching the skin. Tangled hair, whether human or horse, was put down to elves and were called elf locks. And the fairy have been known to kill humans, sometimes because humans have done something harmful to others or the fairy race, sometimes just because the humans didn't follow fairy etiquette. You may have heard the term pixie led, which is when a person gets lost in what should be familiar places to them. The reason has often been put down to the fairy playing games with them and leading them astray. The fairy also like to take things: car keys, TV remotes, crystals, jewellery, anything that they like the look of. Sometimes they take it for fun, and if you leave out an offering for them, the item will suddenly be found. Other times they take it because they want it. Time is an important point. Time runs differently in the fairy world, and it's very easy to lose track of it. One day in the land of fairy may equate to many years passing by in the world of humans. Many tales reflect this, with people entering or being drawn into the fey world and believing they have only spent a few hours there, to come back to our world to find that years have passed by. This time difference does not seem to affect the fairies themselves, just us humans. Biddy Early. Let me tell you a story about a lady called Biddy Early. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of a real woman who lived in Ireland. She was born into a poor farming family in 1798. At the age of 16, she went to work as a servant and later worked for a doctor. Her first marriage was short, her husband sadly dying. Her second marriage produced a son, but again her husband passed away when the child was only 8. It was about the time of her second husband's death that her magic became apparent. The story tells that she was about to be evicted from her home when she received a message from Spirit telling her, when the police arrived in the morning to evict her, to say to them, "Stay where you are," and they would leave and not come back. Biddy did as instructed, and the policeman apparently stood outside for 5 hours, unable to move. Biddy then told them to go away and never return, and it worked. Sadly, her son died as a young man, but it was said he returned in spirit to give her a magical blue bottle. Biddy used this blue bottle to foretell the future, and people would travel for miles to receive messages and predictions from her. She was also known as a healer, using magical herbal potions to cure ailments, not just in humans but also in animals. She didn't make a fortune from her skills, but instead often accepted exchanges of food or drink for her services, and she never turned anyone away. I mention her because she was said to have the ability to talk with the fairies. People would visit her to have fairy curses removed. One story tells of a man who had been bewitched by the little people, with his whole herd of cattle cursed by the fairy. Biddy consulted her blue bottle and advised them to remove a white thorn bush from his property, as he had planted it along a fairy path. As soon as he had done so, his herd returned to full health. Biddy died in 1874, her magical blue bottle never being found. It is said that the fairy had only loaned her the bottle, and on her death they took it back. You can create your own predictive glass bottle. It may not have such great powers as Biddy's, but you never know. Use a glass bottle. If it is blue glass, then even better. Add in dried herbs and plant matter that you associate with divination and psychic skills, perhaps even add in some fairy plants as well. You might also like to drop in a crystal or two. Charge the bottle with the intent of divination. Ask your questions and give the bottle a shake. Read images or symbols that you see within any symbols that you see within the glass bottle for your answer. I like to use a jar or bottle that has a lid, which means you can add ingredients when you feel the need, or you can take some out. Fairy plants, herbs and crystals. Whilst fairy are attracted to all things in nature, there are a few plants and flowers they seem particularly drawn to. They can be grown in your garden, popped into a vase in your home, or used in spell pouches and bottles to attract the fae to you. Foxglove derives its name from little folk's glove, believed to be worn by fairy as hats or gloves, sometimes called goblin thimbles. Primrose. It is said that eating primroses will enable you to see the world of fairy. Create a posy with the correct number of primroses and use it to touch a fairy rock, and you will open the portal to fairyland. The wrong number of primroses would lead you to a land of doom. Ragwort and ryegrass are said to be used by fairies as horses. Use the words horse and hattock to make the stems fly. Wild thyme. Create a drink by brewing the flowers, which must be gathered near the side of a hill where the fairies use the grass as a fairy throne. The brew can then be drunk to enable you to see the fairy world. Cowslips. The fairy love these flowers and are known as Culver's keys, as they are used to unlock the way to fairy gold. Bluebell. Folk name, dead man's bells. If you hear the bluebells ringing, it foretells death. Where the bluebells grow, you will find dangerous fairy enchantments. St. John's wort provides protection against fairy. Rowan. Butter churns are made from rowan wood to protect against fairies and witches stealing or turning the butter. Columbine, Aquilegia. Cornflower, delphinium, alder, evening primrose, ferns, hawthorn, heather, lavender, lily of the valley. And of course, the fae love sparkly things, and that includes crystals. There are some that can be used specifically to call to the fae, such as fluorite, serpentine, pebbles, particularly hag stones. Hold the stone up to your eye so you can see into the other world. Kings and queens. You may also like to work with a fairy king and queen too. Many fairy queens are linked to goddesses. Many goddesses are described not only as a fairy goddess, but also as queen of the fairies. As when dealing with all fairies, mind your manners. This is particularly important with fairy royalty. You need to treat them with respect and reverence. Now, I don't usually advocate kneeling or bowing to the gods, but in the case of fairy kings and queens, you may find this a necessity. One difference between fairy kings and the fairy race is food and drink. If a fairy queen offers you something to eat or drink, then you must accept. It doesn't hold the same trickery as regular fairy food. You won't be bound to the world of fairy, but there may be a favour asked for in exchange, and they will be upfront about it. Diana is one of these. She is primarily cited as a Roman moon goddess, but also regarded as queen of the Fae too. The Snow Queen or Frau Hold or Dame Venus is a goddess and a fairy queen figure. Possibly one of the well-known Queen of the Fae is Queen Mab or Meve, or renamed by Shakespeare as Queen Titania. Morgan Le Fay or Morgana, Morgane and Morgan, her name means Morgan the Fairy. Queen Una, is the Irish fairy queen at the court of the Danu Shi. Queen Celia is a Celtic queen of the Fae. Queen Argante is the fairy queen of Avalon and is connected to Morgan le Fay. What about the fairy king? These have been described as demoted Celtic gods who were forgotten and faded to the realms of fairyland. King Oberon was adopted by Shakespeare to provide a fairy element in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He is, however, presented throughout folklore in many varying aspects, but always as a fairy king. Gwyn ap Nudd is a Celtic ruler of fair Elfland. He is said to reside in the Tor in Glastonbury. King Sil, or Zell, who is claimed to be buried under Silbury Hill in Avebury in the UK. And you also have King Don Fiona. He is an Irish fairy king. The hierarchy of fairy is similar to our own monarchy system. Some of the more high-up fairies are known as trooping fairies, such as those that belong to the Sealy court in Scotland, or the Thena Shi tribe in Ireland. These fairies spend their day lounging about in general pursuits befitting the aristocracy. One of these is to ride out in solemn procession. This is called a fairy raid. They ride majestic fairy horses decked with jewels and fringes of gold. These horses are believed to live for more than 100 years. We also have the Tuatha De Danann, a fairy race from Ireland. They were met in battle by the Milesians and defeated. The Milesians being a tribe believed to be the first Gaels in Ireland. Those that were left by the Tuatha De Danann made their homes in the Hollow Hills, where they became the Daon or the Thena Shi. Originally, this primordial race of fairies was giants, but after their defeat and over time, their size diminished. Their king is Finvara. He is known as Finvara, Finbar, and Fionnubar. His father was Dagda, once known as the chief god of the Tuatha De Danann, and later a fairy king. He, along with the Thena Shi, love to fight and are very skilled with it. Finvara also loves a good game of chess. Fairy types. As I've mentioned, there are many different races and types of fairy. It is an enormous family. But let's look at some of the familiar ones and perhaps the odd one you may not be too familiar with. Elves. There is often a bit of confusion here, as the term elf was originally used as a generic one for a whole group of the Fae. Today it is often used to describe small, even childlike members of the fairy world, such as Santa's little helpers. However, the Norse view the elves, or Alfar as they call them, as tall and beautiful beings, much like the idea of elves in Tolkien's world. Most stories give good accounts of the elves as helpful creatures. Spriggans. The spriggan is, let's go with an unattractive creature. They are quite small in stature, but they have a special ability that allows them to inflate to forms much larger than themselves. The Spriggans are useful to guard hills full of treasure, but they are not to be trusted. They have a reputation as villains and thieves. They quite often rob human households and have been known to steal human children. By all accounts, they are thoroughly unpleasant. Leprechauns. This one is a sly customer who appears and disappears in the blink of an eye, and of course, they know where all the gold is hidden. There is a tale that tells of a farmer who met a leprechaun. The farmer persuaded the leprechaun to show him where the pot of gold was buried. The leprechaun pointed to a field of ragwort plants, showing the farmer the one plant under which the gold was hidden. The farmer tied his red garter to the plant and went home to get a shovel. On returning to the field, the leprechaun had tied red garters to every single plant in the field. Goblins. Malicious is probably a good word to describe the goblin. They, like the Spriggans, are thieves and villains. One of their particular traits is to lure victims to an unpleasant fate using fairy fruits. They also have the ability to shapeshift into animals. Their appearance is often described as ugly. There are a few exceptions to their evil reputation. In Cornwall and Devon in England, in the tin mines, we find a goblin race called the Knockers. Their name comes from them knocking on the walls of the mine to find the veins of ore. Although they tend towards being a bit mischievous, they are generally friendly towards the human miners. Tradition states that a small piece of a miner's lunch, usually part of the pastry from his pasty, should be left for the Knockers to ensure goodwill. The Knockers also get annoyed if you whistle or swear, and may send a shower of small stones your way in return. Dwarves. We are probably all familiar with the image of a dwarf. They are short and stocky and usually with beards. They also tend to always look old. This may be because they reach maturity at a young age of 3 and have a grey beard by the time they are 7 years old. They hail mostly from the mountains of Scandinavia and Germany, where there are miners seeking metals to create armour and magical tools. The dwarves are believed to have created many magical items for the gods, including Thor's hammer. Rumour has it that dwarfs' feet are often deformed, sometimes in the shape like those of a bird. You won't find a dwarf out in the sunlight. They don't come above ground during the daylight hours, as sunlight can turn them to stone. Pixies, or sometimes called piskies, originate from Cornwall, more specifically in the area of Dartmoor. They usually appear with green skin and often shapeshift into hedgehogs. Often you can hear their tiny bells ringing across the moors. You will find them dancing around standing stones or playing along the edges of streams. Unfortunately, they have a bad habit of stealing horses. If they manage to get into your home, they like to throw things around, particularly pots and pans in the kitchen. They are mischievous like many of the fairy race, but they can also be helpful. They have been known to thresh corn during the night in return for bread and cheese. One story tells of a farmer who was very thankful for his nightly assistance with the corn, so much that his wife made the naked pixie a suit of clothes. The pixie was so pleased with them that he declared he didn't need to work again. Unseelie Court. I mentioned the Unseelie Court briefly before. They hail from Scotland and are, well, to be honest, not particularly nice. Some of the Unseelie Court are known as the Host and will fly through the air at night, picking up any humans in their pathway, dragging them along and beating them into submission. They are forced to help the host as they throw elf stock at humans and animals. Each location will also have its own specific evil Unseelie Court members. Seelie Court. The Seelie Court is also from Scotland. The fairies there are described as being pleasant and happy. They have been known to be benevolent, generous, and kind. However, they are still fairy, and some tales tell of actions taken by them that might not seem so accommodating. They follow their own rules and justice. They are quick to work revenge against anyone who would take against the world of fairy. Banshee, which translates as fairy woman. She often attaches herself to a specific family and will appear just before a member of that family is about to die. Other stories tell of the banshee wandering through the darkness of night, wailing and crying. She uses a special comb to brush her hair, and it is believed to be dangerous to pick up the comb you find lying on the ground, just in case it belongs to her. Selkies. Hailing from the Shetland and Orkney Islands is the Selkie, or the Seal Fairy. You will also find them in Ireland, where they are known as Rowan. A female Selkie can shed her skin, literally stepping out of it and revealing a beautiful human-shaped young woman. If a human finds her skin and keeps it, he can force the woman to become his wife. If she finds her skin, she will immediately step back into it and return to the sea, never to see her husband again. The male Selkie takes on the role of avenging those who would kill seals. They raise storms and sink boats. Brownie. Usually the brownie is a small creature with brown wrinkled skin looking like a little old man, often naked but sometimes dressed in tattered clothing. Think about Dobby in Harry Potter. Brownies in the West Highlands apparently have no fingers or toes, and those in the lowlands have no nose. The brownie, if he decides to take up residence in your home, can be very useful and takes his duties with great responsibility. Coming out during the night, he will help with all kinds of household tasks. In return, he expects to be given fresh cream and cake with honey. Don't offer him anything else, particularly not clothes, as this will cause him to leave the household. Just be careful not to offend him, as he can cause havoc if he gets upset. Homework. 1. Have you ever had any experience with the Fae? If you have, we would love to hear about it. 2. Design a fairy altar. Write about what you would decorate it with and why. And please note, you do not need to set it up if you don't want to. Just describe what you would use. 3. Write a spell, charm, or meditation to see and meet a guide to the world of fairy. Again, another note, you don't need to work with a spell or meditation, just create one. 4. If you choose to work with a meditation or spell to meet your Fae guide, write in detail about your experience. 5. Make a fairy divination bottle similar to the Biddy Early design. Detail what you put in it and why. Test it out and let us know how it worked for you. 6. Research 2 different types of fairy and write at least 1 paragraph about each one. Note, working with the world of fairy is not for everyone. If you are uncomfortable doing so, then work with the research-only options in the homework. And your homework should be emailed to your mentor, Ness or Heather, support@kitchenwitchhearth.net. And for further study, we recommend looking at Morgan Daimler's blog, and there is a link to that in the lesson PDF.